I'm Gabriel Metcalf. I'm the CEO of the Committee for Sydney. Welcome to the next installment of Committee for Sydney Live. Today, our topic is managing the economic impacts of COVID-19. You all will have seen that the committee has turned its attention to social and economic recovery. We saw very early on that we were not the public health people, but that our contribution would be in thinking about what can be done to facilitate the most successful recovery out of this possible. So for us, today's event is it's a very big deal, very important to the center of what we are thinking about and what I know many of you are thinking about. Leading this discussion will be Stephen Halmarick. Stephen is the Chief Economist and Head of Global Economic and Markets Research at Commonwealth Bank of Australia. So this is our chance to think about, are we really headed into the biggest recession since the 1930s, as some suggest, or will the impact of COVID-19 turn out to be more manageable, perhaps in part because we're better at managing recessions than we were in the 1930s. How has the government response been so far, and what can we expect? What can we expect in the weeks and months and years to come? I should say that this may be obvious, but this is not an event about the bank's own activities. Stephen is not a decision maker about that. So this is about the economy. He's one of the leading thinkers, one of the leading economists. We're really pleased he's taken time out of his schedule to share his thoughts and observations. The way this works is he'll give his talk. We will be advancing the slides for him. Hopefully that works fine. In the end, go ahead and submit questions via the Zoom app. I will sort through those, combine those, and we'll get through as many as we can. So with that, Stephen, take it away.
Thank you very much for that, and it's certainly a great pleasure to be able to talk to you all today. Thanks for that kind introduction and the invitation. So we certainly are in a very difficult and different economic environment. This is not something any of us have experienced before in our careers, in terms of a recession brought upon by a health crisis and policies to deal with that health crisis. So what I propose to do today is run through what we think is happening globally, but with a global economic outlook, and then narrow down to what's happening here in Australia. And as you mentioned, happy to answer any questions as we get to the end about what's happening in the economy here and the policy response to that. And I think, as you mentioned, the path to recovery is really going to be the critical question from now on. So if we look at the slide pack and we go to slide on page 2, we can see there the path of the COVID-19. So I never thought in my 35-year career that I'd have to start an economic presentation with a slide on the progress of a virus around the world. But you can see in most places, as I say, the curve is beginning to flatten. Certainly the US now is the epicenter of the virus, and we won't get into the politics of what's happening in the US, but it does look like things beginning to slow a little bit there. But clearly the death rate right across the world has been very, very high and quite devastating. So if we flick to slide 3, we can see here the IMF's updated economic forecast for the global economy. And like most other slides at the moment, when you add in what's going to happen in 2020, it kind of goes literally off the chart. So we have to rescale everything. And this makes every other year look like not much happened. But for 2020, the IMF is now forecasting a contraction in global growth of a bit on 3%. So that will be the worst year for the global economy since the Great Depression, so a long time ago. For context, in 2009, in the aftermath of the GFC, growth in the global economy was around 0 for that year. So that was the worst outcome we got, was 0. For this year, we're now expecting -3%. And then the IMF does have a recovery of growth, a quite sharp recovery of nearly 6% in 2021. So very much a V-shaped recovery. To us, that looks overly optimistic. The other thing that's still on the horizon for this year, of course, is the US presidential election. So that will be a big factor as well, 6 months away now. So if we go to the next slide, page 4, you can see here, the path of the recovery, or the slowdown. As I mentioned, 2009 GFC, the global economy grew at around 0. This year, it'll be a bit more than -3%. And I think the main point from this slide is that much of the economic activity that will be lost through 2020 will take years to replace. So we're not expecting a V-shaped recovery in total economic activity. The line on the right-hand side there show you that even if growth does return to around 3% next year, we will have many years of spare capacity in the global economy. So that will keep the unemployment rate higher. That will mean lower wages growth. That will mean lower inflation. That will mean that central banks will need to keep monetary policy at these extraordinarily easy levels for an extended period of time. So flipping on the slide 5 now, that's our forecast in table form. So some of the central banks have not yet officially updated their growth forecast for their individual economies, including here in Australia. So you can see in 2020 for Australia, we've got 2.7% for the central bank forecast, so that's not yet updated. We expect the RBA to update that in early May. And I'll run through why we've got -5% for Australia this year. But you can see in the UK, Eurozone, US, Canada, Japan, expecting negative growth of around 7% or a little bit more this year. China's 1.5%. That's a recession by their standards. And then we have a recovery of growth next year of about 4%, led by the US and China. So flipping forward again, that means, as I mentioned, every major central bank in the world will need to keep monetary policy at these extraordinarily easy levels for an extended period of time. So in summary, every central bank in the world has cut interest rates effectively to 0 and either started or restarted their quantitative easing programs. Where central banks already had interest rates negative, especially Japan and Europe, they have retained those negative interest rate settings. Even the Bank of Japan yesterday, where the cash rate's negative 10 basis points and the 10-year bond yield is targeted at 0%, tried to ease policy a little bit further. So we had these extraordinarily easy monetary policy settings, official interest rates at 0 everywhere, and quantitative easing everywhere, either restarted or started quantitative easing, and of course, that includes us here in Australia. So on slide 7, we just some detail of what I might call, we've dubbed the US Federal Reserve's quantitative easing unlimited. And I won't run through every program there, but essentially the US Federal Reserve is operating in every single fixed income market in the US to ensure ongoing liquidity of those markets. So they're basically buying everything except for equities and the currency. They are operating and buying securities in every fixed income credit market in the US. So I might just pause there and talk about, actually, if we can flip forward through to page 8. Before we talk about the individual economies, I want to talk a little bit about what governments and central banks around the world are trying to do, including here in Australia. So there's 3 main objectives at the moment for all the policymakers, governments, central banks. So the first main objective is clearly to slow or stop the spread of the virus. So that's the number one priority. We need to do that to, of course, avoid deaths, and we need to do that to avoid the health systems being completely overwhelmed by the spread of the virus. And of course, different governments have chosen different ways to try and do that, and with varying degrees of success. But that's the number one priority: stop the spread of the virus. And part of the way you do that is to shut down large parts of the economy. So in some countries like New Zealand, they essentially shut down everything. In other countries, it's been a lot less successful in shutting down. But you need to shut down the economy because you can't have people in close contact. And of course, there's the stay-at-home directives. So by shutting down large parts of the economy to slow the spread of the virus, of course, we create this significant downdraft in economic activity. And so then to offset that, governments have been easing fiscal policy, i.e. spending literally billions of dollars to try and replace some of that economic activity. And we know that there's been varying degrees of success on that. And I like the Reserve Bank Governor's analogy that we're trying to build a bridge. So we're trying to build a bridge for economic activity to keep people and businesses solvent while the economy is in this shutdown period, so that they're there for when the economy reopens. And the third thing which the governments and the central banks are trying to do is maintain the functionality of financial markets. That's really critical. And here I think we have learned the lessons of the GFC. So in 2008 and 2009, global markets stopped functioning. This time round, going back a few weeks now, when it looked like global markets were going to seize up and that another GFC was coming, central banks acted very aggressively, very quickly, and in large scale to ensure that financial markets remained open and functioning. And here the US Federal Reserve really took the lead. And I think that's a really important point, that financial markets largely are now operating as best as you could expect, because central banks acted very quickly to ensure that that was going to be the case. You have to have money continue to flow to where it needs to flow around the economy to keep things operating. So these slides here just show a couple of slides on what's happening in the US economy. You may have heard the US produces what they call initial jobless claims every week. So the number of people applying for unemployment benefits pre-COVID-19, that was around 280,000 a week. And then in the last few weeks, it's been between 4.5 and 6.5 million a week applying for unemployment benefits. So the number of people on unemployment benefits has gone from a few 100,000 to 16 million. And we've seen the unemployment rate, or the unemployment rate is going to rise dramatically because of that. Some estimates I've seen are as high as 20% unemployment rate for the month of April. So if I flip forward one more slide, that's an indicator of what's happening in spending in the US. So you can see retail sales dropping very quickly. The other economy that, of course, is really important to Australia is China. So if we go one more forward, we can see some of the more high-frequency Chinese economic data. So if we just flick one more slide, please. So we're tracking daily economic data in China and trying to compare what's happened this year, post the Lunar New Year holiday, to what happens in a normal year. So the red lines are 2016 to 2019, post-Lunar New Year, and the blue is this year. And you can see that actually there are some signs of economic activity returning to more normal levels in China. And of course, that relates to the timing. So we know the virus started in China and things were shut down there much earlier than everywhere else. Now you're seeing a bit of a recovery in economic activity. If you flick forward to the next slide, you can see that in some of the monthly indicators as well. So industrial production dropped sharply in February, back up a bit in March, but we can see that retail sales are still quite soft, as is investment. And one of the risks for the Chinese economy is second round effects, in that the rest of the world's in recession, and of course China, being a big exporter, will be affected by significantly weaker demand all around the world for their exported products. If you can flick forward now, I think that's highlights for the global economy, and I'm happy to answer any questions on that once we get to the question session. But now it's probably an opportunity to talk just about Australia. So again, the first slide on Australia is the path of the virus. And I think we all know that here in Australia, the news on the path of the virus has been significantly better than we feared it might, and that we've been able to flatten the curve, as they say, quite rapidly. And so the number of new cases now is quite small per day. So that's a fantastic result. I really think that's something that all Australians should be very proud of, that we've been able to do that. And we've been able to do it, I think, with a pretty pragmatic approach across federal government and state government and businesses. So that's the good news. Obviously, the bad news is we still have had quite a number of Australians lose their life or now very sick. But if we go forward one slide, we can look at what this is our expectation of what the economy is going to look like this year. Now, I will say that forecasting the economy is difficult in the best of times, but in the current environment, extremely difficult, because, of course, what we don't know is how long the shutdown will last. And we're working off the government estimate of around about 6 months for things like the JobKeeper payment, job seeker payment increases. But of course, we don't know, and we're just humble economists, and we'll be guided by the medical experts in terms of the period of shutdown. But you can see here, we're expecting in the first quarter of the year, so the quarter ended March, we will likely get a small contraction in economic growth, real GDP minus 0.4%. But then in the June quarter, the current quarter, we will get this absolutely enormous contraction of 8.5% on the quarter. So they're numbers that we have not seen since the Great Depression. And then you can see for the third quarter, we've got a very modest recovery and picking up a bit in the fourth quarter. So for calendar 2020, we have growth in inverted commas of minus 5%. And again, that will be the worst outcome for the Australian economy since the Great Depression. But minus 5% is better than the minus 7% plus we expect in most of the other major economies. And then in 2021, we've got a recovery of around about 3% in Australia. Now that means the unemployment rate is likely to peak at just under 9% in the next couple of months. So it's going to rise from about 5% at the start of this year to 9% in the next couple of months. So when we get the April employment number later in May, and then the May and June, those numbers are going to be very large increase in unemployment, big reductions in employment. So we expect the number of people employed in Australia to drop by over 700,000 in the coming months. But that 9% unemployment rate forecast puts us at the low end of other forecasts you may have seen. Others have got the unemployment rate well into double digits. And the reason why you have a lower unemployment rate forecast than others is because of the way the JobKeeper payment will work. So JobKeeper is where the government will be paying the wages of many people as long as they stay on the books of Australian employers. And people could even be working 0 hours, but technically still be employed and being paid JobKeeper. So the unemployment rate will be limited, the rise in the unemployment rate will be limited by the fact that lots of people who are on JobKeeper may not be doing many hours of work at all, but they'll still be technically employed. The other thing that we expect to happen is the participation rate will fall. So lots of people who lose their jobs in this period may not then actively be seeking other employment. And so from the Australian Bureau of Statistics definition, to be unemployed, you have to not only not be working, but you have to be actively looking for work. If you're not actively looking for work, then you're actually out of the labour market. So the participation rate will fall. But what that means is the unemployment rate itself is not going to be the best indicator of how deep this downturn is. The Reserve Bank has highlighted that hours worked done will probably be the best indicator of how weak the economy is, and they expect hours worked to fall by 20%. So that's a huge reduction in employment activity. The other thing worth highlighting is we expect the inflation rate. So the March quarter inflation rate will be out tomorrow, and we expect that to show annual inflation of about 2%. And then in the June quarter, we expect that to fall close to zero, if not slightly negative. So for the remainder of this year, we look like we'll have inflation around about 0%. That's obviously a substantial decline. So given those numbers, we expect the Reserve Bank to keep monetary policy extraordinarily easy for a long time, at least 3 years. So maybe move forward to the next slide again now. So this is just indicating our unemployment rate forecast. So as I said, up to nearly 9%, and then a very slow decline in the unemployment rate. And you'll see from the chart on the left, we do not expect the unemployment rate to get back to 5% anywhere in our forecast horizon, which currently goes out to the end of 2022. So the unemployment rate rises quickly and will fall back only slowly. And on the right-hand side, you can see which industries employ the most number of people and where the pain points are. So the largest employer says there is PBS, that stands for Professional and Business Services. So that's most of the jobs in the CBDs, business services, professional services, accounting, consulting, office workers, real estate agents, etc., etc. So we need people back into their office buildings and working. The other areas where big employers, of course, is health. And there, of course, we know that the hospitals the medical area is extremely busy. But I've also heard reports that many medical centres are not nearly as busy as they thought they might be because people are just too afraid to go to their doctor for anything other than COVID-19 symptoms. The other big employers, retail, construction, education, accommodations, cafes, restaurants, manufacturing, we certainly, they're the areas the government will be looking at in terms of reopening the economy where you'll get the biggest employment benefit. One more forward, please. So here at CBA, we're quite privileged because we have a large market share and we can see money flowing in and out of Commonwealth bank accounts and credit and debit card activity. So the slide on the left is the percent change in CBA bank account holders receiving job seeker payments. So essentially the unemployment benefit. And we know that the number of people receiving JobKeeper through their CBA bank accounts is up about 50% in the last couple of weeks from this time last year. So it's a massive increase. And the slide on the right-hand side shows all government payments. So we saw the big spike up when the $750 was paid into welfare recipients' accounts, particularly pensioners. Again, one more forward, please. And so we know we've had 3 fiscal packages from the government. First one set about $17 billion, second one $66 billion, third one $130 billion. So these are massive fiscal intervention. We are very supportive of this intervention by the government, absolutely necessary. It will create very large budget deficits, but if the government had done nothing, then the situation in the economy would be considerably worse. And the budget deficit, of course, would have been enormous, given how deep this recession would have been if the government had not spent this money. So if we page forward again, we can see that the budget deficit for 2019-20 and 2020-21, rather than being back in small surplus, will approach 9% of GDP. Again, these are budget deficits the size of which we've not seen out of since the Second World War. And so, of course, the supply of government debt, the volume of government debt on issue is going to rise dramatically. So we've seen Standard & Poor's already say that Australia's AAA credit rating is now in a negative outlook. And so government debt levels are likely to approach 30% of GDP. That is not consistent with a AAA credit rating. But our view is that if Australia loses its AAA credit rating, the practical implications of that will be very minor. So the ability of the Australian government to borrow in Aussie dollars in local markets or global markets is unlikely to be impacted if we lose our AAA credit rating. Next slide, please. And we can see from this slide, which is I've taken from the Grattan Institute, that Australia's fiscal package is one of the largest in the world. And the good news about that is we're in the best position to be able to offer that fiscal support because the budget was in pretty good shape and has been for many years. Moving forward again, please. So we know the Reserve Bank has jumped into unconventional monetary policy. Actually, if you just move one more forward, we can run through what the Reserve Bank is doing. Now, a week or so ago, the governor gave a speech, the Reserve Bank governor, where he said that they expect the Australian economy to be down around 10% in the first half of this year. So we're about 9%, so a similar level, and the unemployment rate to spike a lot higher. He's talking about the unemployment rate approaching 10%. As I mentioned, ours is closer to 9%, and that hours work done of 20% decline. So next slide again, please. So the Reserve Bank has announced a suite of monetary policy measures. The first is which, well, they cut the cash rate down to just 0.25%, 0.25%, and the Reserve Bank governor has made it clear that that is what we call the effective lower bound. So the cash rate will not be going any lower than 0.25%, and we expect the cash rate to remain down there for at least 3 years. The second thing the Reserve Bank's doing is targeting the 3-year government bond yield at that cash rate. So the Reserve Bank is now buying bonds in the secondary bond market, Commonwealth and state government bonds, to ensure that the 3-year Commonwealth bond yield trades around the cash rate. And so far, they've been very effective in achieving that outcome. And the other thing they're trying to do is ensure that the Commonwealth and state government bond markets remain open and effectively operating. And again, so far, they've been quite successful in that outcome. So much so that last week they announced that rather than operating in the markets every day, they were going to operate in the markets 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays and Thursdays. So that's good news. That means the Reserve Bank doesn't need to be buying as many bonds to keep achieving their objectives. One more page forward, please. The third thing the Reserve Bank's doing is funding the banking system through a 3-year fixed-term banking funding facility at the cash rate. So banks can ask for funding at the cash rate for a fixed term of 3 years, and the initial limit for that is $90 billion worth. The more the banking system lends out for businesses, particularly small businesses, the more of that funding can be made available. And there were some tweaks to what we call the interest rate paid on exchange settlement balances. In addition, the government is providing $15 billion of funding for non-bank lenders and small lenders, particularly in the mortgage market, through a facility through the Australian Office of Financial Management. One more slide forward, please. So here at CBA, we have developed a number of tools to help us understand what's happening in the economy. And one of them we launched in July last year, and this is called the Household Spending Intention Series. And what this does is combine our transactional data, so money being spent through the CBA network, with Google search information. And we're using Google search information to tell us what people intend to spend money on. So these days, if someone's going to spend money, first thing they usually do is search for it online, whether it's a house or overseas holiday or a new car or a suit or even just to go to the grocery store. So we can marry together CBA transactional data and Google search data, publicly available Google Trends data, to give us really good forward indicator of what's happening in the economy. So if we go forward one more slide, we can run through the results up to the end of March. So we have 7 different categories, the first being home buying, and you can see our home buying series remained pretty high at the end of March. But that was before most of the restrictions came on around auctions and home going to view homes. So we would imagine that in coming months we'll see the household home buying index come down, and I'll run through some of our house price views shortly. So if we go forward to retail trade, we can see by the end of March, retail trade was strong because we know that people were rushing to the supermarkets to buy all sorts of things, including toilet paper, of course, and rushing to some hardware and DIY places as well. So we had this spike higher in household spending intentions in March, but we know from our CBA, we can see also from the ABS data that was backed up. So we know the Australian Bureau of Statistics tells us that in March this year, retail sales were up 8.5% on the month, which was the largest monthly rise on record. Now, we go forward, we can see travel and entertainment. And not surprisingly, both those spending intention series have collapsed as travel and entertainment venues are closed, and of course the borders have been closed. One more forward, please. We can see health and fitness, education, and motor vehicles. So a big increase in health and fitness in March. That's both people visiting their doctors, but also going to things like home gyms, buying gym equipment, etc. We can see education had been very weak in February, and that was the impact of the bushfires and then the start of homeschooling. A little bit of a bounce in March, and that was on the back of lots of correspondence learning, online learning, free courses offered by the government. And motor vehicle sales, which had been recovering quite strongly late last year and early this year, stalled. Again, not surprising, very difficult to go out and buy a new car or a commercial vehicle in this environment. So that's one way of looking at the economy, through our household spending intention series, monthly data, using our own data and Google information. Now, if we go forward one more slide, we have now looking weekly at people spending money using their CBA credit and debit card. So what we're doing is comparing most recent week to the same week last year. So this is data up until the 17th of April, and we can see total spending on CBA credit and debit cards is down about 20% on the year. And it does look like there's some early signs of stabilisation in that spending. It's been down 15, 20, 18% for the last 3 weeks in a row. You can see goods, spending on goods spiked higher initially. It's now about flat for the year. And spending on services down around 40%. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see retail spending, again, spiked initially, now down marginally, non-retail quite weak. So let's look at some of the details around that if we go forward one. So we can see that in-store spending has collapsed. So after initially jumping higher, i.e. people going to supermarkets, etc., in-store spending is very weak as people are not going to shopping centres, whereas online spending is beginning to rise. And spending on food, you can see, was up really sharply initially. There's that 75% increase in food spending. That's food, what we call goods, so going into the supermarket, the grocery store, as that hoarding phase began. But now we can see food spending is beginning to normalise, whereas buying food in services, which is cafes, restaurants, takeaway, very weak, down around about 40-odd%. One more forward, please. This is different spending. So we've got food and alcohol on the chart on the left. Again, we had a big spike up in alcohol spending, but that's now declined. We can see household furnishings and equipment is really the only part of spending that's increasing significantly. So that's up around about 35%. Looks like lots of home offices being created and lots of DIY projects. You can see spending on recreation, spending on personal care, spending on clothing and footwear, all substantially weaker. One more, please. And if we look at that by state, you can see that the biggest falls, not surprisingly, are in Victoria and New South Wales. So the two big cities, Sydney and Melbourne, the two states more dominated by services sector have seen the biggest declines in spending. Okay, if we click one more forward, we can have a little bit more of a look now at the housing market. And there we've seen auction clearance rates drop substantially. Sydney's in the blue on that chart on the left. And even with mortgage rates at these generational lows, of course, people find it very difficult to sell a house or buy a house at the moment. So that means if we go forward one, that house prices are now expected to fall. So we're forecasting after house prices had started improving through the middle of 2019 and early this year, that nationally house prices will be down 10% over the next 6 months. In Sydney, we have down 10% as well on that 6-month period. So if we go forward one more, that's the table of our forecast there on house prices for every major capital city and the national average. So both nationally and in Sydney, we expect house prices down 10% over the next 6 months. Again, forward one, please. We can see that household debt to income was around 190%. So we know Australian households are quite levered into this housing cycle. And the net wealth of household balance sheets is very much tied up in both the value of their dwelling and the value of their financial assets. And of course, both of them are down quite heavily. So household balance sheets are going to certainly be affected by both the income side of the household balance sheet and the asset side. The offsetting factor, of course, is the cost of that debt is going to be very low for a long time to come. One more forward, please. This is just the Reserve Bank's activity. On the right-hand side there is how many bonds the Reserve Bank's been buying. So you can see after buying some bonds aggressively early on, they've slowed the pace. And the 3-year bond yield, which is the blue line on the slide on the left, is now down at the cash rate and quite stable down at the cash rate. The yield curve has steepened as longer dated yields haven't fallen as far as the short dated yields. And then one more, we'll have a look at the currency. So lots of volatility in the Aussie dollar. It got down into the mid 50 cents, but now back above 60 odd cents. And part of that is because of our success in Australia with controlling the spread of the virus compared to other countries, and some I guess some optimism in markets that the spread of the virus globally may be past its worst, and that we should expect some recovery, particularly in China later this year. But our view is that some of the economic data that's going to come in the coming weeks and months is going to be a lot worse than some of the more optimistic scenarios we're seeing being talked about. And so the markets are going to have to deal with some really, really poor economic statistics before we can see some light through the other side. So I think that's it. If we go forward one more, you can see my disclaimer, which actually goes for 6 pages. So I'll leave you to read that at your leisure. But now I might hand back to you, Gabriel, and happy to answer some questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen. Very comprehensive, and I've got lots of great questions that have already come in. So everybody, feel free again to submit them via the Zoom app. Stephen, we'll begin with the policy question. What else do you think government should be looking to do at this point beyond what it has already done?
Well, I think the key issue now is they've put in place all the policies to ensure a flow of funds to people and businesses. So I think one of the key issues is to actually make sure the money goes where it needs to go. So we need to make sure that the government system, the tax system, the banking system, everything works so that the money actually flows into the pockets of businesses and people as it's designed to do. So I think that's going to be critical. And so need to take away, if you like, some of the bureaucracy and that, make sure the technology works, make sure the money flows. And then, we can have a discussion. I'm sure there might be some questions about the path to the recovery. And so as they open up the economy, where should attention be to try and get the economy back up and running as quickly as possible? But I think at the moment, as we've seen from the Prime Minister and others in recent days, we've been very successful in controlling the spread of the virus. But if we think that that means we can just open up everything and go back to normal, then unfortunately that's not going to happen. We need to stay on top of this to really make sure that we get that curve down as low as humanly possible. We don't want to open up too quickly and then see what's happened in other countries where they thought they've been on top of things and they open up and you get another spike higher in cases.
Right. Everybody wants to be in recovery, but in fact, between lockdown, which we're in now, and recovery is this phase the committee's been calling the transition, when the economy is partly open, partly closed. How long do you think policy should, in a sense, wait for jobs to come back, as opposed to trying to reallocate the labor force into new industries because the old jobs are not going to come back?
I don't think we should wait very long at all. So I think the recovery process needs to start from the premise that, and the Reserve Bank Governor said this, so this is not new, but the recovery process needs to start from the view that if we think that we can just go back to where we were, situation normal, on the other side of this COVID-19 period, then that's not going to happen. So we need to be on the front foot in putting in place policies that improve productivity in Australia, right from the start. And I think the governments at both federal and state level have acknowledged that. So I'm hoping that's what will happen.
A couple questions about Australia's global connectedness. It's been noticed by everybody that Australia is one of the countries that handled COVID better than almost any other place so far. Certainly in the top set of countries. But what is the right way to think about this time when the rest of the world is still in trouble, when there is not very much global travel that's allowed? Does it work to put people in 2-week quarantines when they come here? What is the right way to think about Australia's global economic relationships in the period ahead? Yeah.
Well, I think if we look at the countries that have had more success than others in controlling the virus, being an island helps a lot. So Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, good examples. So, obviously we're a very large island, but with only a few kind of ports of entry. So I think that's helped a lot. I think that does mean that the borders are likely to be closed for quite a long time, as in international borders, with the exception maybe of New Zealand. So we could potentially resume, rugby between Australia and New Zealand, but that may not be a great outcome for Australia, to be frank. But I think our engagement with the rest of the world in terms of travelling, whether it's for work or business, is going to be curtailed probably for the remainder of the year. And we have to have there'll be lots of discussion about Australia's, if you like, reliance on the rest of the world in terms of supply chains and trade, whether we should be thinking about maybe being a little bit less reliant on that. I'm not sure that that's the right outcome, but I'm sure there'll be some discussion. And I think just we've managed this process better than others because I guess at its core, most Australians just want to do the right thing. So I think we've shown ourselves and the rest of the world that when the time comes, we can actually all act in a pretty coordinated and community-minded way, which is a fantastic outcome. You can't say that about every other country in the world.
No, we can't.
Well, we won't mention any names, but anyway.
We won't mention any names just yet. Some questions about the debt. And I'll combine a few here. does the AAA credit rating matter or not matter? If it doesn't matter, did it used to matter or did it never matter? And then how high would the debt need to go before it's actually a problem?
Okay, so a couple of good questions there. So does the AAA credit rating matter? The answer is it depends who you ask. So for financial markets and for borrowing money offshore, so I've been a financial market economist for 35 years, and I've spoken to literally thousands of international buyers of Australian debt, Commonwealth and state debt in that time. And they've all said that AAA rating is a good thing, but AA plus is still pretty good as well. And it's all relative. So Australia's debt is rising now quite sharply, but so is the debt of every other country in the world. And there's very few AAA countries left. And so the difference between AAA and AA plus, let's say, is not much at all. So if we lost our AAA credit rating, I think for all intents and purposes, the extra cost of us raising debt in global markets would be negligible. But politically, probably not such a great thing. Now, our debt at the moment, debt to GDP, so Commonwealth net debt to GDP is a bit under 20%. On our estimates, it'll probably go to a little bit over 30%. And as I said, that's not really compatible with the AAA credit rating. But the average debt of other countries, OECD countries around the world, is closer to 100% of GDP. So the US is going to go through 100%. Japan's actually about 200%. Lots of other European countries well north of 100%. So even at 30% of GDP, that'll be high by our standards, but very low still by global standards. So around the world, of all the OECD nations, even after we've spent 10% of GDP in this recession, we'll still have one of the lowest debts around the world. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is, what's the cost of that debt? Well, two things. What's the interest rate cost? And the other thing is, what's the cost if we had not raised that debt? So the interest rate cost will be extremely low because the Reserve Bank is keeping 3-year bond yields at 0.25%. And the Reserve Bank will buy whatever volume of bonds they need to buy to keep the 3-year bond yield at 0.25%. And the Reserve Bank will be the owners of those bonds. They'll receive the coupon for those bonds. The Reserve Bank doesn't keep all that money. The Reserve Bank repatriates a dividend back to the Commonwealth government every year, depending on the P&L of their activities. So the Commonwealth government will be paying the Reserve Bank interest on a large chunk of that debt, and then the Reserve Bank will be sending that money back to the Commonwealth government as a dividend. So that's how quantitative easing works. And of course, the Reserve Bank's buying all that debt with newly created money. So the economist joke always is, don't try that at home. Don't try and create money at home. Only the Reserve Bank's allowed to do that, but that's the way QE works. You create money, you buy government bonds. And the other thing, as I mentioned, let's imagine the government did not go into budget deficit to the tune of 150, 160 billion by our estimate, and just let the economy sink. Can you imagine the effect that would have had on economic activity, unemployment, and therefore devastated the budget position itself? So this is money well spent.
Does that mean the reverse? Does that mean that government should double what it's done so far and really expand new sectors of the economy?
Well, I think we then get into, if you like, a blurring of lines between the Reserve Bank and the government. So the Reserve Bank governor last week was very clear to stress that they are buying bonds from the secondary market. So they are not directly funding the Commonwealth government. They are lowering the costs of borrowing for the Commonwealth government. They're lowering the cost of borrowing for the state governments, and therefore lowering the cost of borrowing for everybody. They're not directly funding the government. other central banks are flying closer to the wind on that. But there is a school of economic thought that you could just do that. You could just have central banks create money, lend it to the government at almost 0%, and you almost got an unlimited supply of free money. That doesn't sound like a great idea to me.
Stephen, if you were to speculate about which sectors of the economy might never come back at their former strength, and maybe at the same time where there might be potential for new sectors to emerge or sectors to expand, what would you guess?
So I think the fact that the international borders are likely to be closed for pretty much all this year is really going to have a significant impact on education and tourism, unfortunately. Tourism maybe not quite as bad, because I would imagine most Australians are now going to holiday in Australia. Obviously, we've just been through holidays, not many people going anywhere, but when we get to middle of the year or the spring holiday, or even summer at the end of the year, more likely to holiday at home than go overseas. But the education sector is clearly exposed to international students, so that'll be a factor. Although, of course, it can be online learning. I think parts of the economy that could do well, I think there's definitely cause for rethink of things like housing affordability housing policy in Australia, infrastructure, how infrastructure is planned and funded, climate change and energy creation policy. Definitely, this is a great opportunity to really push forward, I think, on policies that both benefit the planet in terms of climate change and energy creation, as well as will create jobs in terms of new infrastructure that's required. The list goes on and on, to be honest.
There's been a lot of awareness about the fragility of global supply chains, which sort of is a euphemism for manufacturing being concentrated in China. Is it realistic to imagine some of that coming back to countries like Australia?
I think that'll definitely be an area of focus, and maybe not just Australia, but other Asian producers. And I think the part of the debate there will be, are we willing to pay a higher cost? So if we bring manufacturing back to Australia, it's probably going to cost more than to produce those goods than if they're manufactured in China. So are we as a country willing to pay a bit more to have things manufactured in Australia to get A, better supply chain certainty, and B, have those jobs here in Australia? I'm not too sure. That's the reversal of like 30 years of policy and outcomes.
Yeah, that'd be quite a major change of direction.
Yeah, for sure.
Any speculation about what this is going to mean for the office market and the residential market, so the real estate?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we expect house prices to be down 10% in the next 6 months. And the other factor, part of that is because it's just difficult to go out and buy a house, and auctions are very difficult. And there's a confidence factor there as well. But there's also the population question. So less overseas migration into Australia, I would imagine particularly into Sydney. So the population growth rate is going to slow dramatically. So that will lower the demand for new residential property. So that's a big factor there. In terms of office space, I guess the big issue is there, a lot of us have learned to work from home, although you probably tell I'm in the office today, but lots of people are learning to work from home. And, I would imagine that some people have found the experience not so bad. And when work comes back, they may want to work from home for whether it's a couple of days a week or permanently or every now and then. So I would imagine that's going to impact on demand for physical office space in the CBDs in particular.
Yeah. Should Australia be printing money to increase the rate of inflation?
Well, that's what we're doing. But we're not going to get much inflation for a long time. So I think I mentioned at the start, so our forecast for the remainder of this year, apart from the first quarter, is inflation will be close to zero. And the reason for that is there's just going to be so much spare capacity in the economy, particularly in the labour market. So it's going to be extremely difficult to get anything more than maybe some pockets of inflation with lots and lots of spare capacity in the economy. And the RBA is printing money. That's what quantitative easing is. They would love to have inflation back into the 2 to 3% target range, but we're not forecasting that over the next 3 years.
All right, I think we're near the end of our time, Stephen. Any closing thoughts you would share about what to be maybe paying attention to as we enter the next phase?
Yeah, so I think we'll need to, well, we need to just kind of hold the line for a while, I think, and make sure that not only is the curve flattened, it's, if we can make it disappear, that'd be fantastic. And then in the opening phase, I think we need to, as we said, like open selectively and carefully and get confidence back. I think confidence is going to be critical. So there may be some, things like just taking your temperatures or testing to really try and get confidence back up. Things like the app that, of course, were launched yesterday, really critical in that discussion as well. And then, as we talked about, I think we have to use this opportunity to look at productivity enhancing reforms. So that's infrastructure, that's tax, that's federal state relations, that's industrial relations, that's climate change and energy policy, that's gender equity policy, that's housing policy. The list goes on, as I said. Reserve Bank Governor has said this clearly. Treasury Secretary has said this clearly. We need to make sure that, I think, some of the political cooperation we've seen across Australia in this period continues in the recovery phase. Stephen,
thank you for taking time to share your thoughts with us. Really interesting. Everyone, thank you for tuning in to Committee for Sydney Live, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right. Goodbye.